What is going on, true believers? James Hancock here. I'm back to discuss WandaVision, coming to us this Friday. It's been quite a while since we've seen any new Marvel content, and to me this new show looks like one of the most interesting stylistic experiments ever attempted within the MCU. I'm sure that writer Jack Schaefer and director Matt Shakman have many surprises in store for us, but from what we've seen so far in the trailers, I'm loving how the show appears to be using meta commentary on different decades of sitcoms like Bewitched and The Brady Bunch in order to tap into and open up and explore some of the most famous moments and stories in the history of comics featuring the Scarlet Witch and Vision. Both of these characters are comic book icons and have played a role in some of the most beloved comic book stories ever written. But what I want to focus on today are some of the classic as well as modern tales that appear to have played a role in inspiring some of the stories we're about to see in shows like WandaVision or movies like Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. Basically, I'm focusing on any story about Wanda and Vision's relationship, their wildly unusual origin stories, their completely insane extended families, but most important of all, the many occasions where Wanda has shown us just how powerful and unpredictable she can be after suffering an intense personal trauma. There's some rumors out there that down the road, Wanda's going to be set up as potentially the next Thanos-level villain for the MCU, but we'll have to wait and see. But we've already had a taste of how powerful she can be in the movies, like when we saw her manipulate the Hulk into a killing rampage in Age of Ultron, or putting the smackdown on Vision in Captain America Civil War. And most impressive of all, we saw her go toe-to-toe with Thanos during the climax of Avengers Endgame. Also, quick weird side note, Wanda and Thanos get it on in Spike Lee's 2013 remake of Oldboy. The movie sucks compared to the original film by Park Chan-wook, but it is an interesting little bit of pop culture trivia. In any event, I'm officially getting off topic. So over the last few days, as a way of getting prepared for this upcoming show, I went down a little bit of an Avengers rabbit hole by dusting off and rereading a lot of my all-time favorite comics featuring Wanda and Vision, things like Vision Quest, which is one of the essentials, or Absolute Vision, or just a personal fave, the Korvac Saga. Not necessarily relevant to this show, but a Dynamite Avengers story nonetheless. But I also went on a bit of a shopping spree on Comixology as a way of avoiding having to go through all my old long boxes looking for individual issues, but luckily most of my trades and graphic novels are within easy reach. But what I've put together for discussion for this video are some of my personal favorite story highlights from the last 55 years, from like the early 60s up through about 2017, and ordinarily I'd organize them all into a giant top 10 list of personal favorites, but because these story arcs occasionally retcon or outright rewrite the stories that came before, I think it makes more sense to go chronologically just to see how all these amazing characters and their stories have evolved over time. What becomes almost comical, no pun intended, is just how many times over the years comic writers were forced either to summarize or simplify or clarify or rewrite official canon. Anytime the Avengers bumped into any of the members of the extended family of Wanda and Vision, whether you're talking the Grim Reaper or the High Evolutionary or Ultron or Magneto, Wonder Man, Hank Pym, you name it, the writer would end up using up half the issue just trying to explain the increasingly complicated backstory. I must have read these origin stories hundreds of times over the years, and they still make my brain feel like it's going to explode. But the reason the writers would do this for Marvel is because it served two purposes. First and foremost, it got new readers up to speed, so they wouldn't feel confused about all the previous Marvel continuity, but for the diehard comic book fans, it opened the doors to collecting back issues and going back and reading classic stories, which I did very aggressively throughout my teens and 20s. And for lore buffs, it's an absolute blast trying to navigate this incredibly elaborate narrative tapestry, even if only a small portion of it ever actually gets used in the official MCU. Also, I should warn non-readers ahead of time that huge chunks of this history lesson will contradict official continuity in the MCU. I'm saying this now so I don't have to keep reminding folks of this discrepancy anytime this elaborate tale veers into truly strange terrain. Also, I can already feel myself starting to get a little bit hoarse, and this video is just getting started, so hang on tight. It's time to get the story underway, and what better place to start than at the beginning. The Scarlet Witch first appeared way back in X-Men #4, written by Stan Lee and drawn by the king of comics, Jack Kirby. She was initially a member of Magneto's Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, and whether or not Magneto's Wanda's father in the comics has been written and rewritten many times over, but we'll get to that later. For now, it's enough to say that the Scarlet Witch's career as a supervillain ended almost as quickly as it began when she and her brother Quicksilver got recruited by Captain America to join the Avengers in issue number 16. And this was the first major shakeup to the lineup of the team since its launch, and it was pretty controversial at the time due to the checkered history of newcomers Hawkeye, Quicksilver, and Scarlet Witch, all of whom were considered villains at different points in their history. And much like in the movies, the team has had a revolving door of members ever since. But the Scarlet Witch has remained a crucial member on and off for decades, earning her iconic status many times over. But for our next key moment in this colorful history story, Wanda was not actually an active member at the time of Avengers 57 and 58 when the world was finally introduced to Vision. Now, these are two of my all-time favorite comics, mostly because of the stunning art by John Buscema, but writer Roy Thomas, he deserves a ton of credit as well. But the tale revealed how Vision was created by Ultron to destroy the Avengers and how he ended up joining them instead. Now, I love the origin story of Vision in the movies, and I think in many ways it actually has an edge over the comics, but in the comics, his origin story is much more weird, it's much more complicated, and it would become increasingly complicated as time went by. But right out of the gate, it was already bananas. In Avengers 58, we learned that Ultron was first created by Henry Pym, who then turned against his creator and erased his memory, and that while Ultron was constructing Vision, he used the recorded brain patterns of the deceased Simon Williams, aka Wonder Man, to give Vision a personality. And for those of you who don't know, Wonder Man was an early villain introduced in Avengers number 9 as one of the original Baron Zemo's Masters of Evil. Wonder Man ended up betraying Zemo and dying in the process as he saved the Avengers, and he would return many years later as one of my all-time favorite members of the team. Basically, a superhero wants to be an actor but makes a living as a stuntman. But given how he and Vision are almost the same person, they eventually declared each other brothers, establishing yet another crucial part of Vision's bizarre family tree. But just so we're keeping this all straight, Ultron is Vision's dad. Henry Pym, aka Ant-Man / Giant Man / Goliath / Yellow Jacket, is Vision's grandfather. And as we would learn years later, Dr. Phineas Horton is kind of a parent as well. He created the original android Human Torch who fought alongside Captain America and the Submariner in World War II. And as we learned in Avengers 135, Ultron claimed to have used this android as the foundation of Vision's construction before he added Wonder Man's brain patterns. And then many more years later, in Avengers West Coast number 50, after they revived the original android Human Torch, Henry Pym hypothesized that Ultron must have used Dr. Horton's spare parts when making the Vision, since Vision is a synthezoid, whereas the Human Torch is an android. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm already getting dizzy discussing this, and we're just getting started. But while I'm on the subject of family trees, let me press pause real quick. Part of the joy of these stories featuring Wanda and Vision is how their family trees connect to other parts of the Marvel Universe. Through Wanda, they're connected to Magneto, which opens the door to the library of X-Men characters, and Wanda's brother Pietro eventually married Crystal, which established a connection with the Inhumans. And don't even mention that show, which completely totally wasted that incredible cast of characters. And then through Vision, we're connected to hardcore villains like Ultron, as well as one of my personal favorites, the Grim Reaper, who's Wonder Man's biological brother, who has died and been resurrected almost as many times as Vision and Wonder Man, but he's obsessed with killing Vision and returning his brother to normal, in spite of the fact that Wonder Man has become so powerful that his fists have been favorably compared to Thor's hammer. But that's enough family tree for now. Let's talk about love. Wanda and Vision, they first met in Avengers 75 and 76, and it wasn't quite time to cue the porno music, but it didn't take long before these two were head over heels in love with one another, something that Quicksilver was totally opposed to, which brings me to one of the greatest sagas in the history of the Avengers, the Kree-Skrull War, which unfolded in stages from Avengers 89 through Avengers 97, featuring astonishing art by legends like Neil Adams, John Buscema, and Sal Buscema. And as you can see here, I have this well-thumbed, bruised and battered version of the Kree-Skrull War, where basically the pages are starting to fall to pieces. I've read it so many times, but it is easily one of the coolest Avengers stories ever conceived by human beings. And it was during this conflict that we got some hot and heavy sexual tension between Wanda and Vision. And we got one of the best comics ever illustrated when Henry Pym explores the interior of Vision's body. And best of all, we have these incredible scenes where Vision expresses some very real human emotions when he starts carving a path through any Skrulls that stand between him and saving Scarlet Witch when she's abducted. And if we ever see the live-action Vision go berserk like this, it's going to be fucking epic. But not long after the events of the Kree-Skrull War, Marvel gave us giant-size Avengers number 4, where Vision and Wanda finally tied the knot. Sadly, the Don Heck art in this issue hasn't aged all that well. I mean, Don Heck, he's an absolute legend, but he can't hold a candle to people like Neil Adams. But it remains an historic issue with this bizarre double marriage alongside Mantis and Swordsman. And yes, that is the same Mantis from the Guardians of the Galaxy movies. So as I mentioned before, Vision learns an additional piece of his origin in Avengers 135, and then in Avengers 160, we had the classic story where the Grim Reaper puts the Vision and Wonder Man on trial. And any issue that features all three of these brothers is always required reading in my book, especially if the issue is written by Jim Shooter, who coincidentally spoke at my high school back when I was a senior. But even more important, Avengers 160 was drawn by the legendary George Perez, who's one of the most important artists ever to be associated with the Avengers. But finally, we get to the story in Avengers 185 to 187, drawn by the great John Byrne, that gives us our first real taste of just how dangerous Wanda could be if she ever turned against her friends. And it's been collected now as a story called Knights of Wundagore, which I have here in this trade paperback. And the background information contained within it is laughably complicated, even by Marvel standards, almost as if the editors at Marvel couldn't decide between 3 completely different contradictory origin stories about Wanda, and so instead, they decided to go with all 3 and just combine them all into one. I can't give you the full summary, but let me give you the juiciest bits. Okay, so when Wanda's mother Magda was about to give birth to twins, she ran away from her power-mad husband and sought shelter at the lab of the High Evolutionary, who had made his lair on Wundagore Mountain. And there he was doing things like evolving animals into humanoids like the cow lady Bova, who eventually became the nanny for Wanda and Pietro as babies. I told you in advance that this would get weird, and Bova's only a small piece of this. In any event, at the same time, we saw over in X-Men 125, also drawn by John Byrne, we had these panels where Magneto is lost in thought, thinking about Magda and how he drove her away. So you had to be reading both comics in order to connect the pieces. But for me, this locks up Magneto as the father of Wanda and Pietro for all time, no matter what later writers have told us. But back on Wundagore Mountain, the night that Pietro and Wanda were born, in this weird, bizarre, strange cosmic coincidence that could only happen in the pages of Marvel Comics, another couple stopped by, and they were expecting a child, and this couple was also seeking help from the High Evolutionary. And this couple was none other than the superheroes, the Wizard and Miss America. And at the time, Bova's plan was to give them Wanda and Pietro along with their baby and claim that they'd had triplets. But sadly, Miss America's child was stillborn and she died in childbirth, prompting Wizard to use his super speed to run away in a state of depression. The reason I mention this is that for many years, a lot of people thought that Wizard and Miss America might be Wanda and Pietro's parents, given how the Wizard basically has the exact same powers as Quicksilver. Is everybody still paying attention? Good. I know I'm confused, and I'm the one talking. Eventually, Wanda and Pietro were given to a couple with the last name Maximoff in a local village, which is where Wanda got her last name. And for much of her life, she believed that was her biological family. But the last piece of this wildly overcomplicated puzzle involves the history of Wundagore, unbeknownst to the High Evolutionary. Centuries ago, an ancient elder god or deity or cosmic being, whatever you want to call him, but this being known as Chthon had been imprisoned inside this mountain by magic. And even earlier, Chthon had created a book called the Darkhold, which is basically like the Necronomicon but on steroids. And over the centuries, this book had always fascinated spellcasters, especially those hoping to free Chthon from his prison. We're in very Lovecraftian territory here. But during her birth, Chthon decided to imbue Wanda with a little bit of his magic, which is why she's always enjoyed this strange hybrid of both her natural mutant abilities of hexes as well as a talent for casting spells. Long story short, Knights of Wundagore is all about how Chthon briefly possesses Wanda, allowing her to mop the floor at the Avengers, and this was our first taste of things to come much further down the road. All right, this video is becoming a workout, and we still haven't made it to my favorite part yet. So by the time we get to the early 80s, we start seeing the stories that were my introduction to all of this insanity. I was born in 1976. I got my introduction to comics in the late 70s when my dad would bring home comics periodically from 7-Eleven. And then I started collecting pretty obsessively in the 1980s. And while I've always loved going back and reading older comics, it's tough to let go of the emotional attachment to the comics you first read as a young kid and a young teen. Which brings me to the Vision and Scarlet Witch 4-issue limited series, followed by the 12-issue maxi series of the same name. And it was during this giant 12-issue series that we finally see the arrival of Wanda and Vision's kids, Tommy and Billy. And Doctor Strange is even there to help with the delivery. What was fun at the time was the way that the early issues of the 12-issue series would cut back and forth with the newly launched West Coast Avengers, later to be renamed Avengers West Coast, just to make alphabetizing my collection that much more difficult. But this shared story going back and forth, it introduced me to the crazy family trees of both Vision and Wanda. And what I really loved at the time was how Wanda was the only person that Ultron was afraid of, because her hex power was one of the only things that he was vulnerable to. Ultron was always rebuilding himself, but once he constructed himself from pure adamantium, he was basically unstoppable, unless Wanda was around to use one of her hexes to put a crack in his impenetrable shell. So having quit the East Coast Avengers in dramatic fashion, Vision and Scarlet Witch became much more affiliated with this new faction of the Avengers led by Hawkeye. Which finally brings me to my favorite story about these two characters, Vision Quest. And this is just one of the all-time greats, written and drawn by John Byrne, and it leads straight into yet another classic story, Darker Than Scarlet. And all this took place in the pages of Avengers West Coast over a period of roughly a year and a half, but basically I was the perfect age for Vision Quest to hit me like a ton of bricks. I was 12 years old when it first got started, I knew my Marvel history, I loved these characters, and all hell was about to break loose. But before we dive into Vision Quest, I should mention that Vision had already made a lot of enemies when he kind of sort of tried to take over the world in Avengers 254. And all this can be found in the collection called Absolute Vision, which even includes a cool story with Monica Rambeau and Doctor Strange, which should excite fans of upcoming movies and shows set in the MCU. We learned later that Vision's actions had been influenced by Ultron, but that didn't matter. The aftermath of this tale led to this fiery debate over whether or not Vision was even truly alive, and if he's not alive, to whom does this sophisticated piece of machinery belong? Who's responsible for his actions? Not everybody shared the view of the Avengers that Vision basically was a live, sentient being. But this giant story begins with Vision being kidnapped and completely dismantled with his entire personality erased. And at age 12, I just found this to be absolutely horrifying. Emotionally, I was so invested in the character, and to see him absolutely torn into 1,000 pieces, it was genuinely upsetting as a reader and as a fan. And from this point on, Wanda's husband was effectively dead, even though Henry Pym immediately got to work reassembling Vision's unusual mix of robotics and synthetic human pieces. As I mentioned before, he's a synthezoid, not an android, as we're reminded of in this really gross panel where we see Wonder Man carrying around Vision's very human-looking body parts. And very quickly after this, we start to see Wanda's emotions beginning to crack, frequently lashing out verbally and physically at her teammates and holding absolutely nothing back against her enemies, like when she used just a simple gesture to completely straight up destroy the facility that had dismantled Vision. And we start to get into full-blown soap opera territory, even more so than usual, when we learn that Wonder Man is actually now in love with Wanda. And consequently, he refuses to let his mind be scanned again in order to give back Vision something resembling his old personality. And when he breaks the news to Wanda, the scene absolutely blew my mind, because Wanda basically drops an entire cliff on top of him. And while Wonder Man basically is indestructible, she still dropped an entire fucking cliff on him, and then shortly thereafter, we see him climbing out of the rubble and then flying off into space, howling in rage. So with Wanda's emotions now basically an open wound, she is ripe and vulnerable to be taken advantage of by precisely the same people who destroyed Vision in the first place. She briefly gets possessed and goes to war with her friends before her sanity is restored for the most part. And at the same time, we're presented with this subplot where Wanda's kids, Tommy and Billy, they keep vanishing inexplicably. But we'll get to more about Tommy and Billy in a moment. But the Vision Quest story finally draws to a close with Vision's return as a much more cold, much more robotic version of his former self. We also saw the return of the original android Human Torch from the 1940s, from whose spare parts Vision was originally assembled. But as we got into the next story arc, this is when Wanda's tale started to get really dark, with John Byrne writing and drawing a story that continues to be referenced up to the present day with characters like Wiccan and Speed in the Young Avengers, which is yet another project that we know Marvel's working hard to bring to Disney+. So it's these details moving forward that start to have a ton of relevance for contemporary Marvel fans. So in spite of having once been burned at the stake, we see the return of the witch Agatha Harkness. She announces to everyone that Wanda's kids simply cease to exist anytime she's not thinking about them. Also, quick side note, many suspect that Kathryn Hahn is playing a version of this character in the show WandaVision. And then the story starts to get really weird when Billy and Tommy are kidnapped by Master Pandemonium. Wanda flips out. She smacks Wasp across the face in anger and starts talking a lot more like her notorious father, Magneto. If you want to know who Master Pandemonium is, he opens the door to yet another ridiculously complicated and weird origin story, but long story short, he nearly died in a car wreck, whereupon the demonic Mephisto arrived and offered to save his life by replacing his missing arm with a demonic arm, and then broke his soul into many pieces, which Master Pandemonium is always trying to retrieve. And we get into straight up Evil Dead territory when Master Pandemonium bonds Wanda's children to him, turning them into his own arms, giving us one of the strangest and most disturbing images from this period. Why he thought having little boys for arms is a good idea, who the hell knows? But with them he gains all kinds of new demonic powers with which he can fight the Avengers. I should also mention that many suspect that Mephisto is going to be introduced as one of the potentially massive villains for future MCU movies and shows. But as we learn over the course of this story, Master Pandemonium was merely a tool for helping Mephisto regain all of his own power after he'd been killed by Franklin Richards, the child of Reed and Sue from the Fantastic Four. And finally, this whole insane chapter draws to a close with Agatha deciding to manipulate Wanda's mind, erasing from it the knowledge that her kids ever existed. A really terrible idea in hindsight because it required everybody to keep their mouths shut, which totally backfired, as we would learn many years later in Avengers Disassembled, when Wasp opens her big mouth to Wanda when they're hanging out by the pool. But this whole episode with Master Pandemonium, even with the memory of her children being totally erased from her mind, this opened the door to Wanda starting to come completely unglued. We see Vision deciding he doesn't want to return to his former self, even if Wonder Man's willing to share his brain patterns, and instead Vision returns to the East Coast to rejoin the original Avengers. And Wanda goes into this catatonic state, opening the door for Magneto to step in and try and help his daughter, which opened the door to Wanda's first major freakout. Her past two freakouts had been the result of possession, but now Wanda was ready to go into full-blown villain mode for a couple of issues, making her one of the most dangerous villains in all of the Marvel Universe. She straight up murders and then resurrects Wonder Man with the snap of her fingers, revealing that she now has the power to reshape the universe at will. So if Wanda ends up becoming a villain in the MCU, that's the level of power people can expect to see. And I have to pause for one moment to go into detail on Avengers West Coast 56. As I mentioned before, I was young while reading these. By the time I read this issue, I was at the impressionable age of 13 when this issue came out, which meant that I was very susceptible to a lot of mixed feelings of confusion and arousal as Wanda decided to both tease and torment Wonder Man over the fact that she's now a free woman. And I'll let you decide what's happening in these panels, but suffice to say, once Wanda started clawing off Wonder Man's costume, this page had my full attention. But in the interest of time, it is time for me to plow on ahead. John Byrne soon left the title Avengers West Coast, and the comic quickly became much less interesting. But after yet another complicated plot involving Immortus, Kang the Conqueror, Agatha Harkness, and multiple timelines nearly being destroyed, Wanda finally returned more or less to her senses once again. And in the years to come, Marvel went through these crazy changes, including the very ill-conceived partial relaunch with Heroes Reborn, but eventually the status quo of the Avengers was restored by writer Kurt Busiek, who wrote some really interesting tales of Wanda, and it was during this time that she finally ended up in a relationship with Wonder Man. Issue 10 of Avengers Volume 3 gave us a really great summary of all of Wanda's complex history up to that point. And at last we finally get to the early 2000s. The first big early superhero movie craze was in full swing. And it was during this time that we saw Marvel Comics making a major comeback, and they started hiring a lot of really cool, edgy writers. And two of the biggest at that time were Mark Millar and Brian Michael Bendis, and they were brought in to make Marvel Comics feel kind of cool and modern again. So we saw Mark Millar reinvent the Avengers in a separate part of the multiverse with the Ultimates, where Wanda and Pietro were basically incestuous. And then over in the core 616 part of the multiverse, Brian Michael Bendis was assigned the task of reinventing the original Avengers with an event called Avengers Disassembled. And this event would basically destroy the entire team, allowing Bendis to form a completely new team in the pages of the new Avengers, which got teased with these mysterious silhouettes for months in advance. But first he needed to swing the wrecking ball and tear it all down, so he used Wanda's powers running amok to make it happen. Now I should acknowledge that Brian Michael Bendis' overly talky and very self-conscious style of storytelling is not for everyone. But there was a time in the early 2000s where I would buy every single comic he wrote, and he was writing tons, both good and bad. And for a couple of years there, he was the most powerful writer at Marvel in terms of dictating which direction the company would go with some of the company-wide crossovers that he was engineering. And eventually I reached the point where I was totally burned out on his style of storytelling, especially in comparison to the mad geniuses out there like Grant Morrison or Warren Ellis or Jonathan Hickman. But at the time of Avengers Disassembled and eventually House of M, I was in my 20s, I was buying more comics than ever before, so I remember these storylines quite vividly. And some highlights from Avengers Disassembled include Vision vomiting up multiple Ultrons who go on a rampage, the Scott Lang Ant-Man getting completely incinerated, She-Hulk goes totally savage and ends up tearing Vision in half, and most notoriously, Hawkeye dies in a blaze of glory. The Brian Michael Bendis era had officially arrived, and it didn't take long for him to cook up the company-wide crossover, House of M. Now that was a giant crossover that basically affected every single comic at Marvel, but the long and the short of it is that the Avengers and the X-Men were having this debate over what to do with Wanda after Avengers Disassembled. Some vote to kill her, but before they can do anything, she uses her powers to completely rewrite reality as we know it and creates a world with mutants enjoying total dominance over the world. And eventually some heroes remember things the way they used to be, they team up, they restored the status quo. Hawkeye got brought back to life, but at the last second before the end of House of M, Wanda uses her powers to take away the powers of every single mutant apart from those who participated in the final battle in House of M. Now, many readers love House of M. I can kind of take it or leave it. I really hated the No More Mutants twist, and I think historically Marvel's presented us with many superior alternate realities, whether you're talking Days of Future Past or Jonathan Hickman's Secret Wars. But Brian Michael Bendis, he eventually reintroduced Hawkeye and Scarlet Witch in New Avengers 26, where they enjoyed a little love affair. But a few months prior to this kinky little moment, writer Alan Heinberg added a major wrinkle to Wanda's story. As it turns out, the children of Wanda and Vision were still alive and were now working as the teenage superheroes Wiccan, and speed in the pages of the Young Avengers. But some of the splash pages by Jim Cheung in this story of the Young Avengers called Family Matters, I think are some of the best pages that he's ever generated as an artist. I should also add that Heinberg wrote Wonder Woman, the good one from 2017, not the recent train wreck. He's a really solid writer, and my hope is that whatever's done with the Young Avengers on Disney Plus, that Kevin Feige has the good sense to make sure that Alan Heinberg is at least partially involved. These characters are his babies after all. Plus, it seems like the MCU loves taking inspiration from really popular 21st century comics, at least comics from the earlier part of the 21st century when comics still had the potential to be popular at all. A lot's changed over the last couple of years. But don't be surprised if a lot of ingredients from both Brian Michael Bendis and Alan Heinberg's stories are included in future MCU shows and movies. But before I wrap up this video, I need to offer one final shout out to a comic series that I think deserves a lot more love and attention. In recent years, it's been really tough for comics to appear culturally relevant when we get to enjoy the MCU on the big screen. Wanda was finally teased at the very end of Winter Soldier, and then she and Vision were officially introduced to the world at large in Age of Ultron in 2015. Although you could argue that Vision was first introduced as Jarvis in the 2008 Iron Man. In any case, it's easy to overlook comics sometimes when compared to this level of spectacle that the movies can offer. But with that in mind, from 2015 to 2017, writer James Robinson gave us an extraordinary run on Scarlet Witch. Not only is James Robinson a phenomenal writer, but I love how in pretty much every single issue, he works with a different artist, giving us a completely different style of storytelling with some of the most glorious pages I've had the pleasure of looking at in recent years. And I feel like this series is a perfect example of how comics can still shine in ways that film and television can't. So if you're looking for something contemporary, this is tough to beat. And I feel like that's the role that comics should have moving forward. They shouldn't try to compete with the movies and shows, but they should be a great idea factory for future shows and movies to draw upon. But I think my voice is starting to fail, so I'm officially done. There are so many classic story arcs and events that could have been included, but I tried my best to focus on the stories that matter most historically as well as personally when it comes to the relationship between Wanda and Vision and their subsequent family. So if you enjoyed this, awesome. Please consider subscribing. And if you end up picking up an old comic and reading it, even better. But if you want to reach out and talk about comics, you can always do so at Colbrax on Twitter. And I'll be back in a few days' time to review the season premiere of WandaVision. So until next time, make mine Marvel.